Good morning and welcome. We have a very packed day for this ODI CAFOD Energy Day, delivering energy for all by 2030. I am Ilmi Granoff, a research associate here at ODI. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get into the substance. The toilets are by the reception. Fire exits are at the side of the building, opposite from the from reception, and also right over here. We have an online audience, so when we get into the Q&A of this session, I'll aim to incorporate them by bringing in a few of their questions or comments. Feel free, online audience, to submit questions via the chat room that's open on our site. When you ask a question, please state your name and affiliation. On this morning panel, we're very open to opening this to a discussion, particularly around the paper that we're going to be discussing, so welcome comments as long as they are relatively brief and entirely on topic. I leave that to you. You're welcome to join online discussion on social media. Energy4all is the hashtag, Energy4all. Please put your phones on silent throughout the session, and there will be lunch at the end of this session and before the afternoon's panel, which you're welcome to. Before the first panel begins, we've asked Dan Kamin as the sort of chair to the entire Energy Day to comment. Dan is a professor at University of California, Berkeley, and the science envoy to the Secretary of State of the United States, John Kerry. Dan, if you want to take a few minutes, you're welcome to use my mic or speak in a booming voice.
A booming voice violates all your rules. Yeah. Maybe I'll just
we have that. Okay.
Briefly. So I just want to thank everyone for being here and encourage you to comment in, especially as governments are really looking hard at their positions around these investments, and the opportunity to shift to positive investing around people-first development is really going to be discussed in a number of back and front rooms in Marrakesh. So comments and opportunities to make that a reality, I think, is one of the key features here. I just want to thank you all, and again, encourage you to stay for lunch and for the second panel as well. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Dan. So without further ado, we will dive into our first session, which is framed around a recent publication called Beyond Coal, Scaling Up Energy to Fight Global Poverty. There are many copies outside, along with other related publications from the organization, many of the organizations involved. I will provide a sort of brief introduction on that before moving to our actual panelists to give some context for the paper. And I urge you, welcome to read. We got some good coverage of the paper over the last week, but I urge you to read the actual paper. There's some real nuance in there. It's very short, purposefully. The context of this exercise of putting together this paper was a bit unusual, not the sort of standard stuff that, for example, my organization, ODI, is involved in that we sort of pull together some evidence, publish a report in the sort of time it takes to kind of coalesce that. This exercise was about a year and a half of work for about 20 pages. The concept was to get a group of organizations focused on poverty and development, but with very strong capacity on climate issues, that knew that coal is really an issue for climate change, but that an ambitious energy agenda is extremely important for the Sustainable Development Goals, our poverty objectives, et cetera, to look at these two issues and try to make sense of them, and come to a common understanding of the evidence on the issue. So we have 12 organizations involved in the process, and that participated in this. And over the course of that year and a half, we focused on what key messages we felt were supported by the evidence that would make sense of this issue. As a consequence of that, this does not cover every issue that defines the relationship between coal, poverty, energy poverty, development, growth, industrialization, employment. So it is very open to criticism that there are issues that are not discussed there. So we'll just put that out now and be honest about it. We don't try to forecast the amount of additional coal-fired capacity that will be built in the world next as an attempt at projections. But what we do is focus on the issues that, as a group of organizations, we felt were strongest on, which is poverty and development objectives, and whether we need more coal-fired power and in a vast expansion of the coal-fired power pipeline to meet those objectives. We came up with 4 conclusions that we thought would be of interest to the development community and the public. Those messages were: more coal will not end energy poverty. There are better solutions for the energy access agenda. 2, coal historically has been given too much credit for reductions in extreme poverty. And while it has made a major contribution to the process of industrialization, prioritizing extreme poverty, the link was not there in the historical record, and often these issues are conflated, and we felt it was important to add this nuance to the discussion. From the perspective of employment, income, growth, and the broader development objective, the evidence is there that better energy options now exist, regardless of whether they were available 2-3 decades ago or 100 years ago. And finally, that the environmental, social, and particularly climate impacts that are caused by coal-fired power and by, in particular, their GHG emissions, will entrench poverty if we continue to expand our use of coal. So those are the highline messages. Our panelists will get into them in greater detail, but I wanted to flag them. Our recommendations focus on really, we have several, but just 2 key messages. One is that public institutions really have to take a hard look at whether they are supporting through finance, public policy, auxiliary support in related infrastructure, how they're supporting the expansion of coal-fired power, and whether their priorities are correct. There really is no reason to be doing that any longer as public institutions, and that we really should be prioritizing what specifically it takes to achieve SDG 7 on ensuring access to affordable, sustainable, and reliable energy for all. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Alison Joy. She is the Principal Climate Advisor at Christian Aid, which was one of the key partners in putting this together, along with CAFOD. Alison, welcome your comments on the paper.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So I'll give quite a brief overview with particular emphasis on the climate agenda. But so if you ask anyone what energy supply, if you had nothing, if you want what energy supply would you most want to meet your needs, virtually everyone would say a strong, reliable grid, electric grid, with seemingly endless supply of power. That is effectively what we have in this country. We have a grid that in fact is so strong that I have a solar panel on my roof at home and I can feed back into that grid. It is the very stable grid that is able to accept the tiniest amount that I produce back into the grid. It's affordable enough that many of the people in this country choose to cook with electricity. But that's not the case in developing countries. Even in the bigger of bigger middle income countries, the grid there, people who have access to the grid, expect almost daily load shedding. That's power cuts, sometimes for up several hours a day. If you're in a rural area, sometimes you only have electricity for a few hours a day. There tends to be a priority given to certain select industries and the elite areas of town for the residential areas. Those grids also, they extend them. They're aging grids in many developing countries. I'm talking about Africa, I'm talking about Central and Southern America, I'm talking about many parts of Asia. They extend the grid, they overextend both transmission and particularly distribution lines, so that the frequency of the power that's coming to the houses fluctuates rapidly, which means either some appliances can't be used or they're damaged very, very quickly. It certainly means you can't then feed back in, you can't synchronise to an unstable grid. So small sources of power are unable to feed back into that grid. The other thing is, in many countries, I mean, even a country like India, in India, some states, about 35% of the electricity produced in the power station is lost in transmission and distribution before it even gets to the houses. That's a combination of old aging systems, inefficiencies in the systems, and theft. So you're losing a third of that grid power before you even get there. So this ideal of this strong power grid is still far off. The conventional solution to that is to pump more power, more electricity into that grid, therefore to produce big centralised power stations. And for many countries, the fuel source of choice is coal. It's in many of these countries, again, Indonesia, Philippines, India, Bangladesh, South Africa, they have a domestic supply. It's a tried and tested technology, and it's viewed as low cost. But of course, that cost does not factor in the fact that coal is historically the single biggest cause of climate change, or contributor to climate change. It's currently the biggest contributor to carbon dioxide emissions in the world. These are countries that are massively threatened by climate change. It's such a contradiction. It doesn't take into the fact that there's local pollution around power stations, that's water and air pollution. It doesn't take into consideration, if Srinivas had been here, who had expected to be here and unfortunately is unwell, he would talk to you about the displaced people from the coal mines across India, the water shortages around many of these coal plants. And it doesn't take into account the fact that many of the up-and-coming renewable sources are becoming more cost competitive with coal. I want to just dispel one myth that there is an idea of clean coal. Many of the donors, Japan, Australia, China, will talk about, we'll only use the cleanest coal technology. Clean technology is a myth. It is still far more emitting than oil and gas power production. You have to fully carbon capture and store the CO2 to get rid of the CO2, and then we can have a whole discussion about carbon capture and storage. So the big question has to be, why do we continue globally to fund a big centralised coal? It's that when there are alternatives, and just as a few alternatives, is to take a much more holistic view of the grid provision. First of all, ageing systems have to be upgraded. They have to be strengthened, the whole system, so that you're not using low tension where you should be using high tension. They have to be smartened so that load management is much more effective. We're talking about doing that in Europe. Why not in many of these countries when you're building grid for the first time? There needs to be investment in both large and small scale renewable energy power. And there has to be, we need to smooth the renewable power, particularly some of the more intermittent sources. So there has to be a much greater interconnection between states, between countries, so that we can smooth out. And we need to start looking seriously at storage of power so that we can use it. And that's battery storage. It's also pumped hydro if it's small, if it's low impact. There are many ways we need to start to innovate. But of course, there are many, over 1 billion people who are off the grid. Most of them are in rural areas. And they have almost no opportunity, in the medium term, I would say, of actually accessing grid power. And for many, or million of them, they will be looking towards decentralised solutions. Their most quickest, most cost-effective way of getting energy out into the rural areas is through either mini-grids or household systems that can deliver directly to them using resources in the local area and hopefully replacing dirty old diesel and kerosene. So we have, for example, we have the Light Up Africa. We also have the UK Energy Africa campaign, which are putting solar home systems, are finding innovative ways of making them affordable and accessible to poorer people. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. But it can't be the end. We're going to ask about what about clean cooking, refrigeration for vaccines, turning a machine for industry. How do we deliver the SDGs? What energy is needed? So I'll come back to this question. why on earth are they still funding coal across the developing world? And I would say a big factor in that is finance and where the money is going. And money still goes towards the lowest risk option. And coal, as a known technology, is often seen as the lowest risk in terms of finance. It's also following vested interests, and there's a lot of global vested interests in coal, oil and gas. Just a little plug for the Christian Aid did a bit of analysis into. So there's two reports. There's one that's coming out next week, which is looking at UK banking and investors, and to see whether from Christian Aid will release that next week, which is to see whether the big banks and the big investors are responding to Paris at all. Are they actually getting their money out of risky fossil fuels? And so far the answer is no. There's lots of nice words, but actually it's not had a big impact yet. And I think we need to get more outraged at the fact that the banks aren't responding to that. But this report I've got here is much more in the public. I think there's a very, very, very important role to be played by public finance, international finance, in driving that shift from fossil fuels and into low carbon and energy access. I think what our research showed is that there is very much two faces of public finance, and that's UK ODA, our export credits, our other ways of investing, but it's also multilateral banks. We looked at the World Bank and the regional banks. All of them are funding innovative renewables, some of it delivering access, some of it for new market mechanisms. There's a lot of innovation from those banks. But they are still, on the other hand, tied to and propping up coal, oil, and gas. And there's no transparency on the carbon footprint of that. There's no recognition that they're tying countries into a fuel which cannot, under the Paris Agreement, cannot continue for decades to come, that they would be invested for. So I think the real challenge is that we should be outraged at this, and that we ought to really push for much, much more transparency about where our public money is and how it can be used to deliver the nationally determined contributions, the low carbon innovations in the developing world.
Thank you so much, Alison. Our next panelist unfortunately couldn't make it. Srinivas Krishnaswamy, who's the CEO of Vasudha Foundation from India. We were really looking forward to him joining us. In addition to contributing to this paper, Vasudha Foundation is known for the very groundbreaking paper, Why Coal is Not Always King, in India, and I urge you to read that if you have an opportunity, especially since he didn't get an opportunity to speak, but unfortunately had medical issues and couldn't come. So we will move next to Johanna Roche, who is the legal director from Tierra Digna in Colombia, to speak a bit about the Colombian context and to think about some of the impacts and issues around transitioning away from coal.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, dear colleagues from CAFOD, Christian Aid, and ADI for having me among you. I want to take this opportunity as well to recognize how relevant is this report that you have made. I'm from Colombia, and I work with the Center for Social Justice Studies, Tierra Digna. And Tierra Digna works with rural communities, which in Colombia could mean at least three things: indigenous people, Afro-descendant communities, and also small-scale farmers. And we defend with them, their right to remain on their territories, and also to pursue their own way of living in the most possible dignifying way. And in Tierra Digna, where we're trying to aim is to help these people to defend alternative ways of living. And these communities have one thing in common. They share the risk that the extractive industries represent to their right to remain on their territories. And when I mean extractive industries, I trying to explain oil exploitation, hydro energy mega projects, but also coal operation. So in our work, we have seen how the impacts and the damages made by the extractive projects look like, among them the coal mining operations and the damages created by these coal mining operations. We have seen how activities like coal exploitation can leave irreversible environmental footprint in the territories where they operate. We have also seen how this footprint can be translated into real human rights breaches. For instance, in the northern region in Colombia, three towns have been forced to displace and to leave their territories and their townships because of the air pollutions caused by the coal operation in that area. And this situation implied not only the violation of cultural and environmental rights, but also is a breach on their right to health, on their right to life, on their right to integrity. And it also is one of the multiple manifestations of forced displacement caused by extractive projects in Colombia. And in our work, we have also seen something that you introduced in your report as more coal with entrenched poverty, where the coal operation is conducted in Colombia cannot survive any other productive projects, especially those that support the rural population's economy, like agriculture, like fisheries, like cultural mills. And we have seen how the small-scale farmers and the fishermen could not keep practicing their own activities because of the coal operation. So indeed, as you stand in the report, more coal would not end poverty, and it has proved that can and will entrench it. And in just one, I just want to add something else. In Colombia, especially where one of the oldest coal operations is taking place, we have people trapped in a shocking paradox. People affected by coal operation to serve energy to the world do not have access to energy. That is a huge paradox. And yet, they are the most affected by the coal operation. You have called it energy poverty, and it is real, it's an issue, and it's a problem, in addition to the crisis created by the coal operations and the coal energy. So I insist, this report that you have made is quite relevant. It is an interesting opportunity to ensure that this kind of history that is happening in Colombia stop happening in my country, but also in other countries. This is the moment to many more can raise their voices to defend the idea of clean energies, if that's possible, and energies free of human rights violations. Energies that must be low cost, yes, reliable, yes, accessible, yes, but especially energies that must not be adverse to human rights. And this is an issue because it would mean that not only states like mine and the other states where these operations are conducted would be responsible for achieving something like that, but also the companies extracting the coal, and also the countries and the companies buying or paying for this coal, and also the citizens enjoying the energy that is produced by coal. So in this moment, the challenge is a challenge to our imaginaries, the way we are living, the way we're demanding the energy to fulfill our needs. And in this scenario, it is the only way possible to change the way energy is created. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johanna. Our final panelist, Sarah Wykes, is the lead analyst for climate and energy at CAFOD.
Okay. Thanks, Elmi. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah, so as CAFOD, we're very proud to be part of the group of organisations that produced this publication. I think Ilmi's outlined this was a piece of work which took quite a lot of time. We're very much approaching this as an organisation whose aim is poverty reduction, humanitarian assistance and development, and we work with partners like Tierra Digna in 42 countries around the world. Why do we believe that we need to move beyond coal as a poverty reduction and development organisation working with some of the poorest communities in the world? I think Alison's outlined the climate issues related to coal as the biggest source of carbon emissions. Basically, what we saw from our research in terms of climate change, obviously, is that climate change threatens to make poverty eradication impossible. It's already undermining the gains that have been made to date in poverty reduction around the world. We did a bit of research last year, and what we found was of the 30 countries that are most vulnerable to changes in weather patterns and hazards, that's including climate change, 26 of those countries are already among the world's poorest countries. So basically, that's of the populations that are most vulnerable to those changes in weather, to climate change, 4 in 10 people are already under the level for extreme poverty, so they're surviving on under $1.25 a day. So climate change is a huge threat to poverty reduction, and it will push people further into poverty. So this is one of the main reasons we think we need to move beyond coal. The other reason is we're coming at this in terms of an organisation that works with people who are living in energy poverty. And as Alison outlined, there is around 1 billion people who don't have access to modern energy, to modern electricity, and there's just under 3 billion people who don't have access to clean and safe cooking. So in terms of the role of coal in reducing energy poverty, we think that coal is basically a 19th century solution. There are other much better, cleaner options for reducing energy poverty and for reaching SDG 7. Alison's outlined the role of the centralized grid in reducing energy poverty. The International Energy Agency thinks that obviously centralized grid is still important, that around a third of investment should still go into the centralized grid. But as Alison outlined, the issue is not about adding generating capacity to grids. It's about transmission, distribution, and connecting people to those grids. And we know that over 84% of people who live without access to electricity actually live in remote rural areas where they are not connected to the grid, and they're unlikely to get connected anytime in the future. So if we want to connect those people to electricity by 2030, we've got to be looking at other solutions. So basically distributed solutions like standalone systems, like solar home systems and mini grids. And I think it's interesting to reflect on the SDG 7 language. SDG 7 is not about it's not just saying access to energy, it's saying access to reliable, affordable, and sustainable modern energy. So we think the best way to achieve that is actually through these distributed electricity solutions and through clean cooking. I think Alison's also outlined how these solutions are often going to be the most cost effective now in terms of connecting people, and that the cost of renewables is reducing all the time. And the report outlines the figures of the cost reductions in the US and in other countries. I think I'll leave it there, but just to say, as far as we're concerned, we think that there's a very clear argument now of why we need to move beyond coal. Alison outlined, some of the challenges that seem to be to that. We have worked for quite a long time on why is there continued public investment in coal. We did some research on the UK support for energy in developing countries, which we published with ODI last year. And what we saw was that in terms of current flows of finance, basically very little of the total energy support in the UK goes to energy access at all, only about 8.5%. And of that, you can't even tell how much is actually going to the distributed solutions and the clean cooking solutions that are needed by people living in energy poverty. Alison's mentioned finance flows through the MDBs. There have been a number of organisations that have done research on this. And what's clear is when you look at the World Bank and the regional development banks, for example, very little of their overall energy portfolio goes to energy access, and even less goes to distributed solutions and clean cooking. In fact, under 2% of the MDBs and the World Bank spending goes into distributed solutions. And in the case of of Africa, which has the biggest population living in energy poverty, just 0.2% of the AFDB's energy access portfolio goes to off-grid and mini-grid solutions. The International Energy Agency has estimated that to end energy poverty, around $23 billion of investment is needed annually into distributed solutions. So if we look even at the current public flows going into distributed solution, there's a huge amount that could be done to end energy poverty without even talking about additional financing.
Thank you, Sarah. Particularly because we lost a panelist, I think that before we open the floor to questions, I want to give a little bit of an opportunity for the panelists to respond to one another a bit, and I will take the moderator's prerogative to respond myself first, because I had a couple of comments I thought to bring out from our speakers' observations. One is a really important point that comes out of the prioritization of moving away from coal-fired power globally for our climate objectives that I want to really emphasize now, and probably should have started with this, which is that out of our analysis of how important climate is for poverty, for avoiding exacerbating poverty, our number one priority globally on this issue is that wealthy countries, plus China, with the vast majority of coal-fired power capacity, need to quickly replace that capacity with clean and sustainable energy sources. And so we start the conversation with there. And it is very important, because we talk about development and poverty issues, that we focus on, that we begin the conversation there. But the conceit of this paper is that the conversation can't end there. The magnitude of the implications of coal-fired power for climate mean that that the conversation does continue, where we really do have to address the expansion of the coal-fired fleet globally, which is largely in the developing country, and particularly developing Asia. And so the context of this, it's very important to be clear, is a full acknowledgement that the number one priority is replacing that existing fleet with cleaner sources in the developed world, but that the conversation can't end there. The one other comment I wanted to make was to draw out Johanna's observation that there's this paradox where you have locations that rely on coal either for mining to supply the world with an energy resource, or even coal-fired capacity, are also often the places that are in energy poverty. One of the figures in the paper from the Vasudha Foundation is a map of India, and obviously it's a bit difficult to see here, but if you grab a copy, it shows where major coal-fired power plants are in India and the household electrification rates. And what you see is that in many of the regions in India with the most coal-fired capacity are also the regions in the direst energy poverty. That paradox highlights that there is that this is not just a debate about on-grid and off-grid, that is a sort of spurious juxtaposition in terms of what we're saying to prioritize, but in fact, even on the grid, expanding coal-fired capacity, particularly at the levels that are targeted by many of these countries, when your existing capacity sits idle and does not provide access, when your number one priority on the grid should be reform of your utility sector to make sure that your capacity actually delivers energy to those without it, is the grid conversation. And again, the conversation can't end with the grid, since even the IEA's estimates, which are very conservative and probably outdated at this point, but it's great to cite the IEA, says that 2/3 of energy access is delivered by distributed sources. So that's probably a gross underestimate. So I just wanted to highlight those 2 points, and then I don't know if panelists have any sort of follow-up observations from each other's comments before we open to the floor.
Just quickly to respond actually to what you've just said as well, is that the UK government, talking about the rich countries acting first, the UK government under Cameron had pledged to get rid of all UK coal by 2025. We need a restatement of that from the May government. They said they will consult on it before it comes into force, and I think we really need to make these poverty reduction issues very, very clear to them as one of our key issues. So I encourage people working in this sector to respond to that. And I would agree that the parallels, I've worked with Srinivas in India for a number of years now, and the issues that were raised for Colombia parallel those that he's found in both mining and power sector, that there is a disregard for the local people and local communities. In India, you weren't allowed to be anti-coal a year ago, but now actually the issue's risen again because many of the coal-burning power stations are in water-scarce areas and they're absorbing a lot of the water from the local communities. So it's an issue that's brought it back to the fore in India.
Yeah, just to build on that. Thanks, Ilmi. So again, I mean, as Alison's saying, we would say that we don't think there's any excuse now in terms of public finance, so whether that's UK bilateral or finance that's going through the multilateral development banks of developed climate development finance from developed countries. We think that there are these clear policy frameworks for development, which is obviously the SDGs and then the Paris Agreement. So we think there should be consistent, clear objectives for development climate finance to implement those 2 frameworks. And within that, we don't think there is any room for continuing to fund fossil fuels, and particularly not for coal. And if we look, for example, if we've looked at the figures that many organisations have looked at, unless in terms of funding the grid and particularly generation, unless there is a really clear poverty reducing impact for that, we think that it's not clear what the continued rationale is for continuing to fund power generation for access reasons. And we also think that points to the need to have much better reporting and monitoring frameworks that can really capture the development and poverty reducing impact of energy investments. And particularly energy access investments. And in the case of the UK, there is no consistent definition of energy access. And there is no clear, transparent kind of reporting framework to show that the investments that are going into energy access are actually delivering, on the ground for people, so that that's bringing them out of energy poverty.
I'd like to open the process to questions and comments from the floor. I'll try to take a couple at a time, I think is probably the best way to do it. If you raise your hand, maybe I can point some folks out.